Recording in progress.
All right, I think we have Dr. Bigler appears on the screen, so we are ready to bring the jury in. Wait for the defendant before we bring the jury in. All right, now we're ready for the jury. Okay. All right. That's fine. I'm gonna text Pam and let her know we're back. I'm gonna swear Dr. Bigler. All right, Mr. Evans, you may call your next witness.
Your Honor, the defense will call Dr. Erin Bigler.
Dr. Bigler, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear
All
you
right,
just
thank
fine.
you. Then I'd ask you to raise your right hand and let me place you under oath. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give in this case to be the truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. And I would ask you to speak loudly enough for us all to be able to hear you, all right? Thank you.
Yes.
And Your Honor, it occurs to me that I'm blocking the juror's view of him.
And if you would like to have a seat at the table, and we'll make sure that your microphone is loud enough if we run into a problem, and we'll reboot. But I think that under the circumstances, that might be, is it table one or table? All right, let's try just staying seated and using that microphone to see if you could pull it toward you and see if we can hear you all right.
Test.
Go ahead, turn it on. I think
Test.
there you go. All right,
Thank you.
you're good. Everybody can see the screen now, is that correct? All right, thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Bigler.
Good morning.
Would you please state your full name, spelling your last, for the benefit of the jury?
Yes, my first name is Erin, E-R-I-N, David Bigler, E-I-G-L-E-R.
And Dr. Bigler, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm a retired professor now. I am a clinical neuropsychologist, and I am professor emeritus of psychology and neuroscience at Brigham Young University.
And what does a neuropsychologist do?
So a neuropsychologist is a psychologist that's interested in the biological or brain basis of behavior. If we start there, the brain is the centerpiece of every aspect of behavior. All human functions in some way or another go back to the brain. The field of neuropsychology is one that developed to look at how different regions of the brain, different aspects of brain function relate to behavior and also relate to different neurologic and neuropsychiatric disorders.
And Tell me a little bit about your educational background.
Certainly. I completed a PhD in psychology in 1974, and at that same time I was the recipient of a National Institute of Health postdoctoral fellowship that I did at the Barrow, that's B-A-R-R-O-W, at the Barrow Neurological Institute at St. Joseph's Hospital and Medical Center in Phoenix, Arizona. I was there for the next 3 years, and upon completing my postdoctoral training, I started my academic career as an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and also was asked to develop the first neuropsychological assessment laboratory for the Texas, what was then called the Texas Department of Mental Health and Mental Retardation at Austin State Hospital. I developed the clinical neuropsychology PhD subspecialty program at the University of Texas, and directed that for the next 13 years. In 1990, I was recruited back to Utah and replicated what I had done at the University of Texas there at Brigham Young University.
And other than your academic work, have you also endeavored in other areas in the area of neuropsychology?
Well, as a professor, I was very involved in research. And because of my background in neuroscience, I was also one of the founding professors to develop the neuroscience program at Brigham Young University. And this in turn led to developing the Brain Imaging and Behavior Laboratory and the Magnetic Resonance Imaging Research Facility at that institution. My background has always been looking at markers of the way brain may function, either physiologically, imaging, or various methods to assess brain structure and function, and then relate that to behaviors that we may be able to assess with psychological tests and other behavioral indices of how the patient is functioning.
And have you testified in other courts as an expert?
I have.
Your Honor, I would move in Dr. Bigler's curriculum vitae as the next number exhibit.
Any objection from the state?
No, Your Honor.
Exhibit 258.
In Your Honor, I would tender Dr. Bigler as an expert in neuroimaging and neuropsychology.
No objection.
All right, he'll be qualified as that type of an expert.
Your Honor, or excuse me, Dr. Bigler, did you perform an evaluation in regard to Mr. Stephen Wiggins at my request?
Of the imaging, that is correct.
All right. So what type of evaluation did you perform regarding Mr. Wiggins?
I reviewed the magnetic resonance imaging, the computed tomography, and positron emission tomography imaging studies that were performed on Mr. Wiggins.
So you're going to have to tell me what all those things are, because I have no idea.
Well, magnetic resonance imaging is our imaging tool that gives us a view of the brain that literally mimics what you would see at postmortem. In fact, in graduate school now, we teach brain anatomy, mostly using magnetic resonance imaging because it so nicely approximates the overall appearance of the brain. Positron emission tomography is another imaging tool, but it's looking at the uptake of a radio tracer, glucose or oxygen, and you're looking at metabolic activity in the brain. but it is based on computed tomography, which is an X-ray based method for imaging the brain, which also gives you an excellent view of the brain, just not as much detail as what you can get with magnetic resonance imaging. The other thing with magnetic resonance imaging is...
And Dr. Bigler, I don't mean to interrupt you, but before we go forward, I want to make sure of one thing. When you're saying magnetic resonance imaging, how would us lay people know that in the common vernacular? What's that called?
Well, that MRI.
Okay. And then the other one that I still can't keep up with what you're calling it, but it started with a P. What's that one?
It's actually with a P, positron emission tomography.
And how would we know that in the common vernacular?
That's PET.
All right, so is that what people call a PET scan sometimes?
That is a PET scan.
All right, so I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I wanted to make sure we were all on the same page. So continue, I'm sorry.
So what magnetic resonance imaging allows now is a quantitative analysis with the aid of sophisticated computer technology. That image can be subjected to analyses that separates out certain regions of the brain, identifies them, and computes their volume, their size, or their shape, and compares it to a normative database. What this means then is that you're not just looking at a brain and saying this brain is appearing to be normal in appearance, but you can also compare it to a normative sample. And this has helped us immensely in neuropsychology because it's allowed us to relate different areas of the brain quantitatively to different aspects of behavior and cognitive ability and emotional functioning in individuals.
And as it relates to your evaluation in this case, did you come to any conclusions in regard to Mr. Wiggins?
Yes. Now, I did not personally examine him. I only examined the imaging data, but we subjected it to clinical review as well as quantitative analysis. And I have run several of those analyses and have a PowerPoint that I could show.
And please do, Dr. Bigler. Explain to the jury what steps you took in relation to Mr. Wiggins. And before you display the PowerPoint, I do want to ask you, did you complete a report in this case?
Yes, I did.
And do you have a copy of that report?
I can pull up a copy of that report, yes.
And with your PowerPoint, if you could, without pulling up a copy of your report at this time, go ahead and explain for the jury what steps you took in relation to Mr. Wiggins and your findings related to your review of the imaging.
Sure. So we'll need to screen share here. And so hopefully this, whoops, we don't want to start with that one. Okay, let me go to full presentation mode. Are you seeing the scan?
Yes, Dr. Bigler.
And are you seeing my cursor?
Yes, Dr. Bigler.
Okay, perfect. So this is Mr. Wiggins' scan, MRI. This is from Vanderbilt Medical Center, and it was obtained on 6/5/2020. And this is what is in the coronal plane. And what that means is it's like a face cut across this way. Hopefully you're seeing not only my PowerPoint, but are you also seeing my face?
Yes, Dr. Bigler.
Okay. This is as if you're looking face on. So if you look over here, this is the right side of the brain. This is the left side of the brain. This is the back of the eye socket here. And one of the basic principles in the brain as well as the body is that there's general symmetry. So in the classroom, I would often hold up my right hand like you can see here, and I would ask the students to imagine what my left hand is going to look like. Because of the biological principle of symmetry, one side should mirror the other. So if I hold up my right hand, you have a good estimate of what my left hand should look like. So when I bring my left hand up, and you can see that they're basically a mirror of one another, that's showing this biological principle of symmetry. So when we look at Mr. Wiggins' brain here, face on, we see in the left hemisphere here, a normal appearing left hemisphere. The darker area here, this is the gray matter of the brain. This is where cell bodies are. And the white matter is a lighter gray, and that's where the brain connects. That's where axons are located. And so where you see this arrow pointing here, there's a dark area. So you don't see it in the left frontal, you see it in the right frontal. And that's some type of a defect in the brain. There's an abnormality that's here. This part of the anterior aspect of the frontal lobe, and I'm going to hold up a brain model. So this is a brain model here. It's casted from an actual healthy adult. But if I hold this like so, you can see that the frontal part of the brain indents down. It indents down like you're seeing in the screen here, and that is also what you're seeing right here. That's that indentation. And so this is the inferior or the bottom frontal area of the brain. So if I hold it like so, you're seeing the base of the frontal lobe. And so this is also just above the orbits. So we call this the orbital frontal region of the brain. And this is the frontal polar region of the brain. So these areas are important for a number of reasons, especially in regard to emotional control and regulation. And so if we progress through the PowerPoint, this is a different slide. So if we go back up here, this is image 30, and this is image 35. So we see this at multiple areas of Mr. Wiggins' frontal area of the brain.
Dr. Bigler, when we're talking about this abnormality, I mean, if I'm understanding you correctly, or tell me if I'm understanding you correctly, each side of the brain should mirror the other, correct?
Correct.
And where the red arrow is pointing does not mirror the left side of his brain. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And that looks kind of like a hole to me. It's in his brain.
It is. It's filled with cerebral spinal fluid.
Right. And I apologize again for interrupting you. I just wanted to make sure that I understood, but go ahead.
Yeah, so this region of the brain is a region that is particularly susceptible to injury. We don't have other scans on Mr. Wiggins. We don't have series of scans from events that happened earlier in his life. So there are several things about this that we could discuss.
And before you go into that, Dr. Bigler, just very specifically, what specific scans of Mr. Wiggins do you have?
We have the magnetic resonance scans that we're looking at here. There's a whole series of them. And we have the PET scan, the positron emission tomography scans. Those are the scans that I have.
And when were those done, the scans?
In 2020.
And I apologize, go ahead. What does the abnormality from the perspective of your scans tell us about Mr. Wiggins' brain?
Well, in review of the records that I have, both from the prosecution side as well as the defense side, there's indication of head trauma that's occurred in Mr. Wiggins. And this is an area that's susceptible to injury from trauma. But I have also seen in the records of Dr. Karen, the neurologist who examined him, that there is physical asymmetry in the face and in the upper extremities, with the left arm being shorter. Well, this is the right hemisphere, and the presence of body asymmetry has implications for brain development abnormalities, including in utero abnormalities. So we have a number of factors here that would have to be taken into consideration trying to understand what this may actually represent.
And just so what does the fact that his arms may not be symmetrical with one another, how his body formed, have to do with a brain abnormality?
Well, that is typically a indication of some kind of early developmental error. Now, it's also my understanding in reviewing the records that he has a seizure onset that begins around age 14. There are many disorders associated with seizures that also are reflective of early error in brain development.
And I mean, is it fair to say that if someone is born with a brain abnormality, that you can see these asymmetries in the way their body forms or the way they grow?
Well, growth it is a process that happens from the point of conception throughout adolescence. And so there can be errors in development and the timing of symmetry that can occur at multiple time points in an individual. And without sequential studies, we don't know how to pinpoint that.
So, Dr. Bigler, what does this, what I'll call, for lack of a better term, a hole in Mr. Wiggins' brain, what does that have to do with behavior? How does that relate to one another?
So I'm going to go back to my model here. So we have 4 lobes in the brain. We have the frontal lobe here, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe back here, and the temporal lobe down here. They are all interrelated, and function is the process of all of this integration of the brain. So please don't think of it as one part of the brain having exclusive control. It's always integrated. But in a general sense, the frontal part of the brain, especially the inferior frontal part of the brain, is involved in emotional control, regulation of emotional-based decision-making. The more superior parts of the frontal area are associated with more contemplative decision making, attention, ability to focus, stay on task. The parietal and occipital areas are involved in various aspects of visual, perceptual abilities and nonverbal processing. And then in a right-handed individual, the left side of the brain tends to be the language-based hemisphere, where we separate it out in terms of expressive and receptive types of language functions. So when we're looking at things neuropsychologically, we're looking at some of those global aspects. But it's so important to realize that it's really the networks in the brain that we're looking at, how those networks connect. And it's the connections that are so important in regulating behavior.
And would an abnormality like the one you see in the slide effectively network, as you call it?
In my opinion, yes, but it's also important to look at the totality of factors that can be observed, not just one area of the brain, but other factors that show up in his imaging, and how to understand all of that in terms of the entirety of brain function.
And you mentioned some other factors that show up in his imaging. What are those?
Well, you asked me to sort of parallel my report. This arrow here is pointing to a brain structure called the corpus callosum, which is involved in integrating information throughout the brain, especially important in terms of processing speed, which I'll discuss a little bit later. There's also this little separation that you see right here, and that too is something that can be just a simple developmental anomaly that is inconsequential, but it's also something associated with head trauma. And then there's an asymmetry in the size and shape of the ventricular system. We look at all of these different aspects. The ventricular system is the internal cavity in the brain that's filled with cerebral spinal fluid. It's pressurized, so it's always pushing out. The brain volume keeps it in check. But again, back to the analogy that one side should quite closely mirror the other side, and there is some asymmetry. This is a side view of that right frontal defect that I discussed earlier. This is another view with another imaging sequence showing this area here, and we developed a three-dimensional model to show this in conjunction with these findings here. These are called white matter hyperintensities.
And what are those?
Again, you can see the white matter in the brain is this darker gray in this particular imaging sequence. In this imaging sequence, the cortical ribbon or gray matter that goes on the outer surface of the brain that you see here, it's lighter. Again, there should be uniform appearance within the white matter, and what we see are some of these little blips here that are bright white, and that's why they're referred to as a white matter hyperintense signal, because in magnetic resonance imaging, you're assessing the radio frequency signal that is in the scan data. Those white matter hyperintensities are quite numerous in Mr. Wiggins, beyond what is typical for his age. In fact, someone in their 30s would be expected to not have any, or at the most one or two white matter hyperintensities on an average basis. So we created a three-dimensional view of this. Would you like me to show that at this time?
I would, Dr. Bigler, but right before you go into the three-dimensional view, again, for me to understand it, these white matter hyperintensities, what is that organically in the brain? What are those white dots representing? Is that brain matter?
It's representing that there's an anomaly within the white matter of the brain. That's where the axons, that's where the brain connects. The clinical significance of this is that there is a higher frequency of white matter hyperintense signal abnormalities that occur in neurologic and neuropsychiatric disorders. It also occurs with a higher frequency in individuals that have a history of epilepsy. So there are multiple factors that occur. It is something also associated with substance abuse. So these are indicators that the white matter of this individual's brain is not optimal.
Is a white matter hyperintensity dead brain matter in and of itself?
Not necessarily, because there may be what's called a perivascular space. That's a space where there's more cerebral spinal fluid filled in there because of reduction in myelin integrity and integrity of the axon itself that's coursing through that region of the brain.
And Dr. Bigler, what did the 3D rendering show?
So I have to stop sharing here for a moment and go to the 3D, which is this one. And it has to activate. And are you seeing the colorized brain here?
Yes, Dr. Bigler.
Okay. So the colorized brain allows us now, this is Mr. Wiggins' brain. So this is not an artist's rendition. This is actually Mr. Wiggins' brain. What we've done is we've isolated the surface of the brain and then separated the different subregions of the brain. So this is his left hemisphere that I'm spinning around here. And this gives us another nice view of the frontal lobe, the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobe. This is the cerebellum down here, and this is the brainstem. And then when we circle back this way, this allows us to look at what are called the subcortical areas of the brain, the deep brain structures. And then the red represents the white matter hyperintensities that are present in his brain. And what you can see is those white matter hyperintensities predominate in the frontal region of the brain here. And they're the same in the left as well. And then if I tilt the brain back like this, make it a little bit smaller, this large red area is where that inferior frontal defect is in the brain. So this area right here. So this shows us that we have these white matter hyperintensities that tend to congregate in the frontal area, and then we have this inferior frontal defect in the right base of the frontal lobe. What this in turn suggests then is that frontal lobe function and frontal lobe regulation is likely affected in someone with these kinds of findings.
And what you've noted from Mr. Wiggins' brain, is it your opinion that they would have likely occurred during the neurodevelopmental period, as early as birth or before?
Not necessarily, because again, white matter hyperintensities are something that are associated with a multitude of factors that he was exposed to, including trauma and substance abuse. And this defect down here is something that is common in association with cerebral trauma. For example, this is an actual human skull here, and if I hold it very close to the camera, you can see that there's some very rough ridges that are in this area of the brain, and that can damage that very base of the frontal lobe and produce these kinds of problems that we're seeing here. But there's also developmental pathology that can occur where the brain doesn't develop normally. And that's another part of this assessment. And if you'll watch here, if I click on this and then watch over here, what happens? So if I click here, it's identifying this region here, the superior frontal region of the brain. So one of the other analyses that we did is we looked at the size of these different regions of the brain and how they matched up in comparison to a normative sample. And we'll see that there are changes in a number of these frontal areas and temporal areas of the brain. And then these also relate to what shows up on the PET imaging, the metabolic imaging of the brain.
Can you explain, Dr. Bigler, the difference between what an MRI shows in reference to the brain and what a PET scan shows in reference to the brain and how it works?
Yes. Is it okay if I go back to my PowerPoint?
Yes, Dr. Bigler.
Okay, so I'm going to stop this and I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint. So one of the analyses that we did on Mr. Wiggins, you can see that here. This is what's called the triage brain atrophy report. And you can see the images up here. They're colorized like that 3D imaging that I was just showing. And now it's comparing to a normative database. And what it's showing here is these areas that are in red are substantially reduced. And like I clicked on and showed that superior frontal region, that's this region right here in the brain, it's reduced in Mr. Wiggins on his quantitative image analysis. So now there will be another expert, and that is Dr. Newberg, who will be talking about the PET imaging. So what you see on the screen right now, where my cursor is, that's the MRI, and a very different image appears with the PET scan. Here is the PET scan. Because what you're looking at with the PET scan is the uptake of glucose in the brain. So all brain cells, you have 300 billion brain cells, all of them have to have a continuous supply of glucose. The brain cells have no capacity to store energy, so they're constantly using that energy. And what the PET scan does is it highlights areas in the brain and their uptake, and it compares that to a normative sample. So you can see the MRI gives you this beautiful detail.
Dr. Bigler, I hate to interrupt you. We're not able to see the image your cursor's on because of the the drop-down menu for the other screen views. I wonder,
Oh, okay, so,
in that right corner.
oh, I see. Okay, can you see the cursor now?
No.
Huh. But you can see the PET scan?
No, no, Dr. Bigler. Your Honor,
Oh,
is it possible?
okay, let me go back,
When he has his. We'll see if we can reconfigure.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Dr. Bigler, if you'll go back to that screen you were trying to demonstrate, let us see if we can reconfigure anything.
Okay. All right, I need to pull up my. Did that?
Yeah,
has it
give us
shown
just
up now?
give us a moment to see if we can reconfigure it. All right, it's been removed now from the screen, so I think you can go forward with it.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Are you seeing the PowerPoint now?
Yes, Dr. Bigler.
Okay. And you're still seeing it?
Yes.
Okay. And now you can see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. I apologize for these technical problems. This is the PET image. You can see in the MRI that you get this beautiful detail of the gross appearance of the brain. Whereas in the PET scan, you're literally looking at the uptake of glucose, and you're comparing different regions. But the point that I was trying to make here, with the last 3D image of the brain that I was showing, and I clicked on the superior frontal gyrus, well, when we look at the superior frontal gyrus quantitatively with the MRI, it has reduced volume. When PET imaging looks at it, it has a difference a significant difference in the uptake, right superior. So now what you're doing is you're looking at the MRI findings integrated with the...
Dr. Bigler, if you can hold on just for one moment. We're having some technical difficulties of our own.
Modern technology does not compensate for a judge who is that close. So, all right, let's try it again.
All right, Dr. Bigler, proceed. I apologize for the interruption.
Go back to what part?
Go back to it. Inferior frontal gyrus.
Okay, so...
I did not touch that.
Hold on just a second, Dr. Bigler. All right, Dr. Bigler, I apologize for the interruption once again, but if you could start again where you left off regarding the inferior frontal gyrus.
I'm well aware of technology problems. I began my career with only a chalkboard and ended it with having problems with smart boards. So I fully understand. What you're seeing on the screen here is the MRI, which gives us this beautiful detail of brain structure. But PET gives us more information about the uptake and activity of different regions of the brain and how those regions are functioning. And then we can go back and relate areas of findings on MRI with areas of findings on PET imaging, and then relate that back to clinical observations and findings. And for example, Dr. Karen's observations on her physical exam and the nature of the seizures that he's having, and the right hemisphere aspect of that suggesting abnormalities in these regions. So we have this clinical correlation that's telling us that things are not normal in Mr. Wiggins' brain.
And do the PET and the MRI corroborate one another?
To a certain extent, they're looking at different aspects of the imaging. One is structural imaging, the other is functional imaging. But then you also take it another step and integrate that with the neuropsychological testing, like Dr. Watson has done, and the overall clinical picture of the individual.
Well, let me ask you this. When you looked at the PET, and from your review of the PET, does the function of Mr. Wiggins' brain appear to be the abnormality in Mr. Wiggins' brain? Does it show up in the same areas on the PET scan?
Yes, many of those areas overlap. That is correct.
Now, and I should have asked you this earlier, and in light of all the technical difficulties, you had originally intended to be here live. Isn't that right?
That is correct.
And you ultimately are here by Zoom. Can you explain for the jury why you're not here personally?
Yes. My wife of 50 years is disabled, and she has multiple medical problems. This last year she had a stroke and a heart attack, and she has what's called interstitial lung disease. So she's at great risk for COVID. We're fully vaccinated. Had things been under control and we didn't have the Delta variant, I would have traveled. But this is way too risky in my view. And I have asthma. So those two factors made it such that I did not feel comfortable traveling.
Thank you, Dr. Bigler. And I want to get back to your slides. I think you have a slide coming up that talks about the networking and global functions of the brain. And I was hoping maybe you could talk to the jury a little bit about that with the assistance of that slide.
Yeah. So actually, the next before we get to that, the other part that should be discussed are the adverse childhood experiences and how that influences the brain, because that in turn relates to networks.
And how is it that, from your perspective, that childhood maltreatment on brain structure, how does it affect brain structure?
So the brain is considered to be a experience-dependent developmental organ that takes 25 years, maybe even longer, to develop. So has this very long span of development And during that development, there is what is referred to as a size-function relationship. And as brain imaging became more sophisticated in its ability to analyze and to study, individuals started to examine maltreatment in childhood and adverse childhood experiences, from poor nutrition to physical and verbal abuse, etc., and doing these types of quantitative analyses. And what this research has shown is that there are certain regions of the brain that are affected. And as seen in this particular slide here, associated with various forms of abuse, the frontal region of the brain is particularly susceptible to changes, including the areas of the brain where we see changes in Mr. Wiggins. So if we go back to this here, these areas that we see in red can be influenced by physical trauma. They can also be influenced by adverse events, and they can be influenced by health practices of the individual and substance abuse. So these things are objectively demonstrated in Mr. Wiggins, and from what I gather in reviewing the records, he would meet criteria for adverse childhood experiences, and that would mean his brain is more susceptible to changes in these areas as a result of that.
And Dr. Bigler, if I understood you, you had two different categories you spoke of just then. One was the effects on the brain from one, physical trauma. And
Correct.
Earlier, I think you testified about the front, the frontal area of the brain, especially the right frontal lobe, that area specifically was susceptible to head trauma. Is that correct?
Well, both areas, not just the right, but the inferior frontal region of the brain. This region right here is particularly susceptible to the effects of trauma, and especially like multiple concussive events.
And when you talk about concussive events, is someone being hit or slapped repeatedly in the head qualify potentially as those types of events?
It can be. A lot of that type of trauma is what we would refer to as subconcussive. But subconcussive can build over time, especially if it's repeated in a very short period of time, where the head is pummeled, and that can injure the brain. And
then you've got this, you testified about the adverse childhood experiences. Is that mostly, that science based on witnessing abuse, not necessarily experiencing physical trauma?
That's correct. That can be the emotional side. That can also be nutritional. The brain has high energy demands in development. High calorie load is needed for normal brain development. And if there's any factor that affects nutrition, availability of food, as well as what the emotional and social environment is like, that can alter the brain.
When you say alter, does that mean physically alter how the brain is formed?
That's correct.
Now, we talked a little bit about Mr. Wiggins' physical asymmetry.
Yes.
And is that physical asymmetry indicative of an issue with Mr. Wiggins in utero or during early developmental years.
In my opinion, that is correct.
Now, we talked a little bit about the abnormality, what I've been calling a hole. I think you call it a lesion or an abnormality, but in the right frontal lobe of Mr. Wiggins. We've also talked about these white matter hyperintensities. How does this all come together when you're trying to evaluate what you would expect out of someone's behavior who had these types of abnormalities in their brain? How does this all come together?
Well, this would be the appropriate time to discuss brain networks, which is this slide right here. And what this refers to is like a color coding of multiple regions of the brain that all have to be connected and functioning adequately and efficiently. Notice up here at the top that decoding 100 trillion messages is what our brain is doing at any one time. It's an incredibly complex system. It has to be integrated, it has to be connected, it has to have certain regulatory and control centers. If regions of the brain are affected, and it diminishes the functioning of these complex networks. And the more findings that you have in a scan that suggests that it's deviating from normal, the greater the likelihood is that there will be some level of network dysfunction in that individual, and it will relate to their neurologic and neuropsychiatric problems.
And how so?
Well, for example, if there's frontal lobe dysfunction, if you look here, this color coding here relates to neuropsychological measures of what are called executive control function, but that actually happens between parts of what is going on in the frontal area, the parietal area, and the temporal area, and they all have to be connected. And they have to be connected in fast and efficient pathways. One of the findings that Dr. Watson has is altered processing speed. Altered processing speed interferes with the brain's regulatory ability, and it affects how the brain can function.
Now, if you take someone with a brain like we've discussed, when you looked at Mr. Wiggins' brain specifically, with the right frontal abnormality, or hole as I've been calling it, if they were also exposed to childhood abuse, would that worsen their brain function or their brain problems?
In my opinion, it would, and it would also relate to the clinical presentation of the individual at that point in time.
And I mean, how does someone with this type of brain, that, like Mr. Wiggins, with the types of problems we discussed, how does that affect how he functions in the world?
Well, when we see these kinds of problems, they occur in individuals that are more likely to have impulse control and emotional dysregulation, problems with attention and ability to stay on task and be focused. Those are common associations with these type of problems.
Your Honor, at this time, I would like to move as the next exhibit a copy of Dr. Bigler's PowerPoint presentation.
All right. Is it 259? Exhibit 259.
And Your Honor, is Dr. Bigler's report dated July 7th as the next exhibit.
All right, that would be 260.
One moment.
It's 259.
Your Honor, those are my questions.
State have questions?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Bigler.
Good morning.
My name is Ray Crouch. I'm the district attorney representing the state of Tennessee in this case.
Yes.
I just have a few follow-up questions for you. To clarify, you did not examine the defendant?
That is correct. I did not see him, interview him. I've only reviewed the imaging files and the reports of the different consultants, both prosecution and defense.
You've never had any personal interaction with the defendant?
No,
And so you are relying upon scans that were provided to you by someone else?
correct.
And you didn't actually conduct any of the imaging yourself?
No.
Thank you. Do you know when the imaging was conducted?
Yes.
And when was that?
Well, the MRI, I'll need to pull up my file here.
Okay.
The MRI was done on June 5th, 2020, and the PET imaging was done later. The scan date is October 9th, 2020.
Thank you. And doctor, I asked because we've just been moved and seen an exhibit of your report, and on line 2 of the report it says that the imaging was on August the 5th of 2020.
Yes, that was my mistake. I didn't catch that, and that is my error.
Okay.
You can see from what I presented in the PowerPoint, the dates are there.
But you're just, to be clear, you've only reviewed one set of images, MRI, and that was from June 5th of 2020.
I have the PET imaging. I did not do any analysis with the PET imaging.
Okay. Now, have you compared, or do you know of the existence of any MRIs or PET imaging prior to May the 30th of 2018?
No,
So your entire opinion is based on imaging that occurred 2 years after the murder?
that is correct.
Okay. And with the two different types of imaging that you've discussed, both the MRI and the PET scan, do either one of those technologies have the ability to date or predate an abnormality?
There sometimes can be ways of dating an abnormality. In Mr. Wiggins' case, no, we don't have a way of dating the abnormalities.
So you don't know, and you can't give us an opinion as to when these abnormalities occurred?
No, that is why I've been discussing the findings in terms of a number of options that may relate.
I understand it, but what's important in that is that you've never had an interaction or discussed the defendant's history with him personally. You're relying upon information you've received from other people.
That is all correct.
Okay, thank you. Do you know what medications the defendant was taking on June the 5th of 2020 when the imaging was conducted?
Yes, I think, I don't have them right in front of me, but Dr. Shack in his report lists them.
Does medication cause interference with PET scans?
Medication can influence PET imaging.
In what ways?
It can alter activation patterns in the brain. These will be questions for Dr. Newberg, though.
Okay. So you can't give us an opinion as to how the defendant's medication altered or if it offered the PET scan images?
No, I will not render an opinion on that.
Okay. Can you tell us what the control group was or the normative group as you discussed with the MRIs?
With the PET MRI?
Yes, PET and MRI.
Okay, well, again, I'll defer to Dr. Newberg to discuss the normative sample. The normative sample for NeuroQuant, the images that I showed and the comparisons made, that normative sample is based on thousands of individuals who form a normative database that is used by that program.
Do you know if any of the individuals in that normative database were taking the same medications that the defendant was taking when this imaging occurred?
Those individuals were typically screened to be healthy controls. They may have been on some medications, but for the most part, they were healthy controls. But medications are mostly not consequential in terms of structural imaging with MRI.
What about with PET scan?
The PET scan medications may be a factor, and that'll be a question for Dr. Newberg.
Okay. I want to talk specifically about the white matter hyperintensities.
Sure.
Can those come and go in people? Meaning, can you perform a scan and have white matter hyperintensities and later on those same white matter hyperintensities not appear?
That can occur.
Okay. And again, you've already testified that the scanning that has occurred cannot date the white matter hyperintensities. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Would an opinion given by you or any of these other doctors that we may hear from be more accurate if you had imaging that occurred prior to May 30th of 2018, which was the date of the homicide?
Certainly.
Thank you. Can you discuss with us the effect that substance abuse may have on imaging?
Substance abuse can damage the brain, and substance abuse can affect the vasculature, and it can disrupt the integrity of brain cells, causing cellular death. And that can change the size and shape of different regions of the brain.
And when we talk about substance abuse, that's kind of a large category. What about methamphetamine specifically?
So methamphetamine can be associated with white matter hyperintensities. White matter hyperintensities get related to vascular changes, and stimulant abuse can affect the cardiovascular system, which in turn may affect the vasculature in the brain and result in higher frequency of white matter hyperintensities.
Thank you. Also, Dr. Bigler, you state in the report that your findings are non-specific. What does that mean?
Well, I think the line of questioning that you've brought so far, where we don't have prior scans, and we don't have the kind of sequential information to answer what these abnormalities represent in their fullness. we certainly have enough, in my opinion, to indicate that there is underlying brain pathology in Mr. Wiggins. We don't have all of the information that we need to understand the etiology.
Some of the findings that you have highlighted in the defendant could also be found in people that don't commit homicides.
That's correct.
Thank you. I'll pass the witness.
Redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. So, Dr. Bigler, say you can't date, to give a specific date of when these either the lesion in the right frontal lobe of Mr. Wiggins' brain occurred, correct?
That's correct.
Let's take that first, though. But would you expect, based on your expertise, would you expect to see the physical asymmetries that are found in Mr. Wiggins based on Dr. Kieran's neurological examination? Would you expect to see those in someone who had a normal functioning brain in utero and through childhood?
No, not at all. In fact, I think that's a clear indication that something was amiss in brain development. And then, again, in the clinical history, all of the references to problems that he had with emotional control early on, and then the seizure onset in early adolescence. In my view, those are hard findings indicating that the brain was not functioning normally.
And not functioning normally through childhood, correct?
That is through childhood. That is correct.
And is there clinical significance based on your findings to the fact that the white matter hyperintensities are congregated in the same area where the lesion is?
Well, again, I think from the totality, if you look at Dr. Kieran's report and Mr. Wiggins' report with the onset of his seizures and how he has a left side deficit in visual processing and the left side is shorter, that is suggesting that there's greater right hemisphere pathology. We see that on the imaging. And again, if you look at the clinical history, that type of clinical history is one where you anticipate that you'll see greater abnormalities and anomalies in frontal and temporal lobe structure and function. And that's what the MRI and PET tell us.
And just to be clear, do medications in any way affect the MRI scans showing the structure of the brain?
Probably not. The structure is something that's more constant and less affected by transient medication effects.
And based on your review of that MRI scan, do you have any doubt whatsoever, in your professional opinion, that Mr. Wiggins has something like a hole or a lesion in his right frontal lobe?
In the inferior right frontal area, that's true.
Now, you were asked several questions about whether or not you actually did the MRI. Do you typically do the MRIs? The actual scan themselves?
No, the actual scan is usually done by a technician.
All right. So that wouldn't be something you would do in the normal course of evaluating any MRI scan, would it?
That's correct.
And from what, do you ever personally do the PET scan?
I have been involved in PET research projects, but I do not personally do any aspect of PET imaging.
Right. And would you normally receive imaging data from a technician who actually conducted, took the pictures either through MRI or PET and review those?
That's the way it's done. That's correct.
And that standard course that you would rely upon that data even though you weren't there when it personally was taken?
That is correct.
And you also said you relied upon other reports from like Dr. Karen and Dr. Watson, some other experts. Is that normal for you to do that in your role, to rely upon the reports of other professionals?
That's correct. As I have said a couple of times in my testimony, there's this process that's referred to as clinical correlation. And clinical correlation means taking in the history and then the various test results, the conclusion of other experts, and attempting to integrate that information.
And do you typically, in your field of expertise, deliver opinions based on review of MRIs and reports from other experts? You typically make those types of opinions based on that type of information?
Yes, all the time.
And is there anything in your expertise, in your field of expertise specifically, that prevents you from rendering opinions based on your review of the neuroimaging in a case, based on the fact that you simply have never met the person whose scan you're reviewing?
No, I'm not making a diagnosis. I am merely reporting the observations of the analyses that were performed.
Thank you, Dr. Bigler.
General Crouch, any further questions?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Dr. Bigler, just a couple of follow-up questions. Your previous testimony, you said that the brain changes as we all grow, I guess in the first 25 years of our lives. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So in the first 25 years of life, if a MRI was conducted every year, would there be structural changes, or what type of change would we see in an MRI?
Yes, in fact, I know my Vita was introduced. We've published extensively on this very thing, where we've followed children from age 3 on into mid-adulthood. There are dynamic changes that occur in the brain. Interestingly, that gray matter that I showed earlier, that shrinks, and white matter tends to increase with the aging process because the brain is so dependent on connectivity. So there are, in fact, very dynamic changes that occur in the structural aspect of the brain, especially over the first 3 decades of life.
And in this particular case, we have no imaging from those first 3 decades.
We don't.
And methamphetamine use, it can actually change the structure of the brain. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And let me talk one last question about PET scan. I'm not talking about methamphetamine use, but certain prescription medications can skew the result of a PET scan. Is that correct?
So I'll defer that to Dr. Newberg.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further, Mr. Evans?
Just one. Dr. Bigler, you said that methamphetamine could possibly change the structure of the brain. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Methamphetamine use in an adult cause the structure of the brain, or excuse me, would that cause physical asymmetries like we talked about before?
You mean like the inferior frontal defect?
Yeah, well, would methamphetamine use necessarily lead to someone who had physical asymmetries like we talked about?
Oh, you mean, no. The size of his left hand is abnormal reflexes on the left side, no.
Those are my questions.
Anything further? Thank you, Doctor. Are we finished with Dr.? Are we finished with Dr. Bigler?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, then, Dr. Bigler, we will release you and we will allow you to exit our hearing.
All right, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are almost at the noon hour, we're about 22. You have a short witness that's before lunch?
No, Your Honor.
All right. I believe there was one matter that, was there something that we were going to discuss over the lunch break, if I recall correctly? All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and start taking a little bit of an early lunch. We'll still shoot to come back at 1 o'clock, but there are some matters I've got. If you'll go ahead and exit with our bailiff, then we'll have you come back in at, hopefully at 1 o'clock. Well, hold on just a moment. I believe in our pre-trial conference, we had discussed the fact that the state, or that the defense has a witness that's going to have some social history. Is that your next witness, or is one later in the day?
Your Honor, I've got to check and see who's in the hall, but ideally he'll be later in the day. He would not
All right.
be the next
And then is that the issue? You said, I think, General Krause, that there were some issues regarding that testimony. Do you want to address that now, or do you want to wait till closer to in time to the witness testify? All right. Well, under those circumstances, then we'll just go ahead and take our lunch recess. We will stand in recess. Before that witness, so that we're clear on the process. When that witness is called, Mr. Evans, would you please identify that individual as being the one that we may need a jury out hearing? Then if at that point in time, I'd like to address those issues before the jury hears anything from that witness.
Yes, Your Honor.
And there's a PowerPoint, and so what we're going to do over lunch is identify the specific slides that we're objecting to, that way we're not.
That's fine. If there's a PowerPoint presentation, you can use this lunch hour to try to identify those things that you have an objection to, and we'll go from there. All right, then we will stand in recess until 1 o'clock.
Recording stopped.
All right.